Even before earning a PhD in historical geography at the University of Glasgow, I was keenly interested in locating the origins of some of the religious political ideas that were scattered across the American South. I was compelled to understand how our ancestors in America could be so religious yet insist on separation of church and state. The separation of church and state made no sense to me because I observed school officials saying prayers at public school events and before athletic contests. Through research and observation, I eventually came to see the notion of separation of church and state as more than a coexistence of government and church bodies with no paths crossed. Indeed, what the colonists in Ulster and America wanted was a government that did not meddle in theological affairs, but they expected the government to protect the institution. In other words, they wanted to do away with a church body that was more interested in helping to achieve the political goals of their earthly sovereign than they were Christ, their heavenly king. On today's Vantage Point, we're going to take a trip back to the 17th century to see how the politics of religion played a role in the everyday life of people who lived along the shores of the North Channel of the Irish Sea. Believe it or not, their experiences contributed to the political ethos of the American Bible Belt. I hope you'll join me. Because of the plantation of Ulster under King James, the monarchy was a critical player in the birth of Protestant Northern Ireland and its culture of religious segregation that featured an in-grouping process that reinforced social and institutional ties with the southwest of Scotland and not with Irish Catholics. Until the ascension of Archbishop William Laud and Lord Deputy Thomas Wentworth in 1633, Irish bishops and ministers made allowances for freedom in religious practices. Consequently, polity issues amongst Protestants during the formative years of the plantation of Ulster were really of minimal importance. If one didn't take communion from a Catholic priest, that is. Despite there being antipathy between Roman Catholics and Protestants, King James wanted to import loyal Protestants to Ireland to dilute the power of resident papists. With William Laud and Wentworth to help him, Charles I stubbornly continued his father's attempts to create ecclesiastical uniformity throughout his realm. Charles insisted on the deposal or firing of Ulster ministers who opposed his controllable model of episcopacy, breaking the short-lived tradition of toleration in the Protestant polity. This meant that Presbyterian, Quaker, and Baptist worshippers were not legally permitted to publicly worship with those who shared their rituals and their practices. At least 7 of the Ulster-Scots ministers with Presbyterian sympathies relocated across the North Channel to fill pulpits in the southwest of Scotland. This happened after the Presbyterian element within the Scottish Church or Kirk launched its successful protests in opposition to Archbishop William Laud's liturgy that precipitated the National Covenant in 1638. Those deposed or fired ministers included Robert Blair, John Livingston, George Dunbar, Henry Colwert, James Hamilton, Robert Cunningham, and John Ridge. 2 more ministers were deposed, but Josiah Welsh died in 1634 and Edward Bryce died before his deposition could be carried out. Robert Blair accepted the ministry at Ayr in July 1638. Under the direction of the General Assembly in Scotland, he relocated to St. Andrews in October 1639. Blair became an active member of the Scottish General Assembly and was an important voice in support of the British Civil War that raged from August 1638 to September 1651. Upon arriving in Scotland, the 7 ministers from Ireland joined the charismatic, staunchly Presbyterian and Puritan divines of the region. David Dixon of Irvine and Samuel Rutherford at Amwith were not only among the Southwest's most charismatic and inspirational spokesmen or spokespeople for their Puritan anti-prelatic cause, they were also articulate, educated, and well-connected members of the Scottish ecclesiastical intelligentsia that was formed decades earlier by Andrew Melville, the former principal of the University of Glasgow, my alma mater. In addition to those returning ministers, many of their loyal followers relocated with them as well. As John Livingston wrote in his autobiography, many of the religious people in the north of Ireland had left it in the year 1637 when the deposed ministers were forced out of it. Many who didn't relocate often made the trip across the North Channel to take communion from their ousted ministers, while others made the trip to have their babies baptized. Even churches that kept their own Scottish ministers were sympathetic to the deposed preachers from Ulster. For example, David Dixon and his congregation in Irving welcomed ousted preachers and visiting Ulster laity into their church. According to Robert Blair, on the 26th of March that year, 1637, the communion was celebrated at Irving, where Messrs. Blair and Livingston were employed. Many resorted to this communion even out of Ireland, out of the parishes Bangor and Clergy. Their wives and some of the eldest children came over. Before their depositions, Blair had served as minister at Bangor, and Livingston had likewise served at Clergy. On one occasion, Livingston recorded that 500 Ulster Scots attended his communion in Scotland, and 28 children were baptized. The relocation of the ousted Ulster clergy and members of their respective congregations on the eastern shores of the Irish Sea had an impact on both the Scottish religious and political landscapes. A shipload of Ulster Scots, wrote Scottish liturgical scholar G.W. Sprout, returned to the west of Scotland in 1638 and introduced their Irish novations into their mother church. Such was the origin of the party which degraded our worship and in the end allied itself with Cromwell and secretaries and ruined the covenanting movement. In that instance, Sprout was speaking of the National Covenant of 1638 and the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643. An important distinction to make here is that he was not referring to the militant Covenanter movement in the southwest that surfaced after the Stuart Restoration in 1660. In discussing Sprout's observation, W.D. Bailey pointed out that the Ulster Scots brought practices with them to the southwest of Scotland that they had learned in Ireland through commingling with Congregational Puritans from England like John Ridge and Henry Calvert. Ridge and Calvert relocated to the southwest of Scotland after their depositions from Ulster pulpits. That's kind of interesting, even though they were English. With an emphasis on teaching reading skills and a belief in the priesthood of the individual, these clergy and their Scottish colleagues had empowered lay members of their congregations in Ulster to assume leadership roles in informal worship services. Those skills allowed the laity to continue their religious practices during extended absences of their college-educated ministers or clergy. Robert Blair's exhausting teaching duties were not limited to Sunday sermons. In Ireland, Blair taught and ministered to 1,200 adult parishioners and their children. He felt that they needed more instruction in the catechism, so he conducted 4 public services per week and then spent 1 or 2 days a week providing instruction to families in the community. Regardless of the reason for the absence of a minister, an education provided by Blair and other ministers enabled lay people to hold private meetings and prayer conferences without the immediate oversight of ordained clergy. Through the Ulster experience, Bailey further observed that the Ulster Scots soon began to fall into the form and spirit of Congregationalism, or Brownism as it was called back then. Brownism was renowned for its opposition to all set or ritualistic forms of public worship, including the use of Lord's Prayer, to private devotions in the church by a minister, to singing of the Gloria Patri at the end of the Psalms, and to use the creed at baptism. Finally, they were indifferent to all rules of ceremonial, however simple. When ousted Irish ministers like Ridge, Blair, and Calvert relocated to Scotland, they brought those novations with them. Their opposition to the Kirk's episcopal polity after the Restoration and the government's lack of tolerance for their dissenting practices encouraged them to meet in conventicles or field meetings, which were private outdoor meetings of the kind that they had held in Ireland. In America, we'll call those field meetings or tent revivals. The King's Dragoons often put those down with bloody venom. Theologically trained congregations on the shores of the Irish Sea culture area no doubt increased expectations of many to participate in polity or governance matters. Not just in the church, but in the state if they could. That's why America was so appealing to them. Lay member-led meetings held the Ulster Puritans together between the mid-1630s and June 10, 1642, at which time the Scottish army chaplains sent by the Scottish Covenanting Party to quell the 1641 Irish Rising, Catholic Rising that is, helped the laity to establish the first official presbytery at Carrickfergus. The establishment of the Army Presbytery represents the real birth of Presbyterianism. From its founding on 10 June 1642 with 5 ministers and 4 elders, the Army Presbytery in Ulster had grown by 1660 to include 5 presbyteries that employed 70 ministers. Also by 1660, the Army Presbytery, which had been renamed the Presbytery of Ulster in 1646, served 80 congregations with 100,000 communicants. Wow, that's quite a bit. Even as late as 1714, observed Bishop MacMahon, I'll get that straight in just a second, Calvinist immigrants from the neighboring country of Scotland are coming over here daily in large groups of families. Edward Synge, Bishop of Tuam, estimated that in the decade between 1690 and 1700, 50,000 Scots families settled in Ulster. Apparently to meet the heavy demand for its ministries, the Presbytery of Ulster, which was renamed the Synod of Ulster in 1690, this was the year that the Scottish Kirk, by the way, became Presbyterian, was reorganized in 1702 and 9 presbyteries were formed. At that time, there were nearly 120 congregations and more than 100 ministers serving an estimated 250,000 Scots immigrants. The number of Presbyterian congregations at the Restoration of 1660 was doubled by 1715. The most recent of the arrivals had been Covenanters, so the tone of Ulster Presbyterianism, already prevailingly Puritan, took on the added strictness and rigidity of that persuasion. Beginning in 1717, Ulster Presbyterians and others who didn't belong to the Church of Ireland, which was a branch of the Church of England, operating in Ireland. The Church of Scotland was likewise a branch of the Church of England, but it operated in Scotland. Began to migrate to America to avoid some of the penalties that non-conforming Christians endured. Penal acts, they called them. According to historical sociologist James Liebern, there were 5 waves of Ulster folk relocating to America in the 18th century. They mostly settled across the Upper South, where their commitment to Christianity is still prevalent in the region. Their presence, along with an active Christian ethos, has given the region its colloquial name, the Bible Belt. If you're interested in a deeper dive into this topic, I invite you to get a copy of my book, In Search of Ulster-Scots Land, The Birth and Geotheological Imagings of a Transatlantic People, 1603 to 1707. I'll get it out in just a second. It's a long title. University of South Carolina Press, though. Until I see you again, folks, may the good Lord bless and keep you. May He make His face shine on you and give you peace. Bye-bye.